So in chapter 10, we talked about the motor system and movement to some degree. And starting in this chapter, we are going to talk a little bit more about other areas contributing to movement, namely the basal ganglia and cerebellum. So I'm going to try to divide it up into hopefully 15-minute approximately sections to make them easy to digest. And I will first talk about the basal ganglia and their structure and function, and then I'll talk about basal ganglia disorders, and then we'll go on to talk about the cerebellum and the cerebellar disorders, and then I'll have a short section on movement and different movement disorders. So it's a really interesting area. As I think I've probably mentioned to you guys before, I work in a Parkinson's specialty program that's called LSVT Big, that is a movement therapy. There are definitely a lot of other functions of the basal ganglia besides movement, but control of movement is one of its main functions. So in the chapter, there is a lot of really great detail about the anatomy and the different nuclei. So when we're talking about a ganglia, we're talking about groups of neurons. It's a grouping of groups of neurons, if that makes sense. Each nuclei is a group of neurons, and the ganglia is a cluster of them. And so usually a ganglion, ganglia is the plural, it's a group of sets of neurons that perform a common function. So at its base, at its most simple function, the basal ganglia serves to predict the effects of various actions and make and execute action plans. So that's not very simple at all, right? It's quite complex. So a lot of our complex movements are performed by the basal ganglia. So we'll look at a couple of pictures, but the basal ganglia is located in the cerebrum and midbrain area. Like I said before, anything that's right in the center there is probably pretty important. So I have the nuclei that are included in the basal ganglia listed here. I don't expect you to memorize them. Really, for this chapter, I want you to get main concepts and not focus as much on memorization. So I will point that out a couple times during the lecture, but I'm just listing them, so then you'll be familiar with the word and you hear it sometime and you go, oh, that sounds familiar, or oh, that's part of the basal ganglia, something like that. So I don't expect you to memorize them. So some of them are located in the cerebrum, the caudate, the putamen, and the globus pallidus, and others within the diencephalon and the midbrain, the subthalamic nucleus, and the substantia nigra. The substantia nigra is the part of the midbrain that produces dopamine. So when you have dopamine deficient disorders such as Parkinson's disease, those substantia nigra cells are the ones that start to die out. So in this cross section, and this is from page 234 in the book, you can kind of see that even though they're grouped together by function, they're kind of spread throughout the brain. So the substantia nigra cells are those dark cells down at the bottom, and those, when you, of course you can't do this in a live person, but if you look at someone who has Parkinson's after the fact, after they've died, you can look at the brain and you can see that the substantia nigra cells are not there anymore. So it's, instead of being dark at the bottom, it's lighter. So there are some really pretty cool pictures in the book. This is a 3D view of the basal ganglia. I don't expect you to know the detail on this, but I just think it's it would be neat if they were really that color in the brain. I don't think they are, but when we look at that cross section, we see that they're not. But it just kind of gives you an idea of the relationship of the different areas of the basal ganglia. So really, that's mostly what I want you to get out of this. Plus, it's a pretty picture, and I like pretty pictures. So in the module, there's also that cross-section view that we just looked at in the PowerPoint. There is a 3.5-minute video. It's a neuroanatomy brain slice video. It's you don't really need to know it for this class, but it's pretty cool. And so if you like to geek out on anatomy stuff, well then there you go. And if you don't really want to know that level of detail, then don't spend your 3.5 minutes watching that video. So the basal ganglia actually have a lot of functions. They exert their function through neurotransmitters. So, and, trading neurotransmitters with other areas of the body, just like everything else in the nervous system. So, there are some excitatory neurotransmitters that are involved in basal ganglia function, like glutamate, and some inhibitory neurotransmitters involved. And of course, we know that whether a neurotransmitter is excitatory or inhibitory has largely to do with what receptor it binds to. So dopamine tends to be inhibitory in basal ganglia function. In other areas where it functions, it might be excitatory. But basically, the basal ganglia they adjust signals to inhibit unwanted movement, and the dopamine allows the basal ganglia to apply the appropriate level of inhibition. So that's all the detail I'm going to get into on that. So the basal ganglia motor circuit, it regulates muscle contraction, muscle force, multi-joint movements, and the sequence of movements. So that's all pretty basic for just our normal day-to-day movements. It includes cerebral cortex motor areas, and then some of those other nuclei that we discussed as part of the basal ganglion circuit. The basal ganglia has a profound effect on movement, but it has no direct output to lower motor neurons. So it exerts its effect through the cerebral cortex. So there is a little chart, table 11.1, that's on page 235 in the book, and I don't expect you to memorize this, so don't even think about it. But it kind of says which structure in the basal ganglia has what role in the motor circuit. So some of the structures receive input from the cerebral cortex, the premotor and motor cortex. Some of them process information within the circuit, and some of them send output to motor areas of the cerebral cortex. So it's basically like a decision-making circuit, almost. And it also has that function as a decision-making circuit in other things besides motor processes. So in the module, I have a list of really all the functions of the basal ganglia, the motor functions specifically, and we'll talk about some of the other functions as well. So regulating muscle contraction, muscle tone, and force, controlling speed and fluidity of movement, preventing unwanted movement, regulating multi-joint movements and sequencing of movement. So things like walking, that's obviously a multi-joint movement, and it requires a specific sequence in order to do it safely and correctly. The basal ganglia select and inhibit specific motor synergies. They initiate automatic repetitive skills like piano playing or car driving. So when you get in the car in the morning, you don't have to go through a whole conscious planning process. You just jump in the car and go, because you've learned and you've developed those automatic repetitive skills, and so you don't have to think it through every time you do it. A lot of times in therapy, we end up with people with basal ganglia dysfunction, we end up sort of relearning these automatic repetitive skills because they do have to think about it. Because they don't have the basal ganglia in the background making those decisions and controlling processes, you can actually go by another circuit through the prefrontal cortex to make those decisions consciously, but it takes a lot more effort. in order to do it, because you do have to do it consciously. It's like every time you get in the car, you have to think about how to do it. And so it makes it a much more laborious process. The basal ganglia also affect voluntary muscles and those involuntary postural and girdle muscles. So, like I said before, functioning basal ganglia are vital for normal movements, but they don't have a direct connection to the lower motor neurons. Their influence is through the motor areas of the cerebral cortex and the pedunculopontine nucleus, or the PPN, in the midbrain. So this is the same thing as that table 11.1, saying what the function is. I don't want you to memorize this. It's just there for information. So there's a chart on page 235 in the book that shows basically the three pathways of the basal ganglia's influence on motor situations. So again, I don't want you to memorize this, but in this diagram, the black arrows are inhibitory influences and the red arrows are excitatory influences. So the basal ganglia basically have three pathways by which they can affect motor acts. So they can inhibit the motor thalamus, contributing to a normal level of activity in the motor cortex. So that's kind of all we need to know about that. They can also inhibit the PPN, which has an effect on the postural and girdle muscles. So the motor thalamus inhibition affects voluntary muscles. The PPN inhibition affects postural and girdle muscles. And then it has an effect through the midbrain locomotor region, which affects walking. So, and I put this in bold in the module too. I don't expect you to memorize this level of detail, but just be aware of the fact that the basal ganglia are working in three different routes to regulate movement through the motor thalamus, the PPN, and the midbrain. That's all I need you to know. So if you find this basal ganglia thing fascinating and you want more detail, you can look at these 3-minute videos on direct and indirect initiation and inhibition of movement by the basal ganglia. You do not need to know this stuff for the exam. So maybe you'll just bookmark those and come back to them later for when you don't have as much stuff to study. That's my idea. Maybe we'll go with it. Okay, so besides the motor functions of the basal ganglia, it also has executive, social, behavioral, and emotional functions. So wow, that's pretty much everything, right? Motor, executive, social, behavioral, and emotional functions. So the basal ganglia are a huge part of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So they talk about the loops, and they're information loops or neural loops from the basal ganglia to the thalamus that include 4 different loops: the oculomotor loop, the executive loop, the behavioral flexibility and control loop, and the limbic loop. So the loops contribute to the prediction of future events and selecting desired behaviors and preventing undesired behaviors. They contribute to motor learning, shifting attention, and spatial working memory. So that's remembering where stuff is and remembering your working memory to just process what's going on around you. So the example, this is just a picture of some of the loops, and this is more detail than I want you to know, but this is in the PowerPoint, and I'm just pointing it out because I just want you to appreciate the complexity of it. But don't spend a lot of time studying this or anything, just to know that there is a lot of there's a lot going on besides just motor in the basal ganglia function. We'll do an example of how it works. So in the PowerPoint, it talks about specific areas. It talks about the head of the caudate being part of the decision-making loop that participates in goal-directed behavior. Goal-directed behavior is one of the hallmark signs of executive function. So adults basically have an executive function. We can make decisions and we can participate in goal-directed behavior. Children, their brains aren't as developed and they're oftentimes unable to participate in goal-directed behavior. They don't take into account the consequences of their actions. So once they're fully cognitively developed, then they can have full executive function, and the basal ganglia play a big role. So the basal ganglia evaluate information for making perceptual decisions, planning, and choosing actions in the context of what's going on right at that minute. The basal ganglia is active in learning and changing its activity before the cortex when reward contingencies are reversed. In other words, you start studying that really complicated chart and then you go, you know what? I'm wasting my time because this isn't going to be on the test and it's not going to be on the board exam. And so I'm going to change my behavior and learn something else. So that's our basal ganglia speaking there. The executive, social, behavioral, and emotional loops are not involved in controlling movements. They're just doing their part of it besides the movement. So I'm going to go through the example that they give in the book, and I'm just taking out some of the anatomical details just to make it a little more, bring it down to a day-to-day function. So the example they give, you're driving to a job interview and you're running a little late. Of course, in the back of my brain it says, wow, you should have left earlier, but that's just my brain. So you're coming up to an intersection and the green light turns yellow. Your basal ganglia have to evaluate how heavy the traffic is, how much time you have, whether or not to risk running the light as it turns red. And once the decision is made by the executive decision-making loop, then the motor loop initiates either hitting the brakes or hitting the gas. So there's a lot that goes into that. So in that context, you might hit the gas because you don't want to be late for that job interview. And you've assessed all the other factors. So in a different context, like you're in that same intersection, but you're driving to the grocery store, it's your day off, you don't have any time constraints, you're more relaxed, and the light turns yellow. So the same area in the basal ganglia evaluate the full context and select the appropriate action. So maybe you decide to hit the gas. You know, I can make it before the light turns red. And then at the last second, you see a bicyclist coming up, and you go, nope, change my mind. I'm going to hit the brakes. So the basal ganglia has a big function in deciding that in context, taking in the spatial awareness of the area and making decisions and changes when you do that. So one of the things with basal ganglia dysfunction is people lack behavioral flexibility. And so it's harder for them to make on-the-fly decisions like that. So that behavioral flexibility is part of that basal ganglia function. Very interesting, right? And that's that active learning context aspect of it. So in the book there is table 11.2, and it talks about the role of each of the different loops, which is pretty interesting. So if you had to say, like, which loop, the motor loop selects movement and actions, the ocular motor loop makes decisions about eye movements and spatial attention. So catching that bicyclist out of the corner of your eye, that was the ocular motor loop. The executive loop is your goal-directed behavior, making perceptual decisions, plans, and deciding on actions in context. And the behavioral flexibility and control loop, that's social disapproval. So like you might make sure that you cover your mouth with a Kleenex when you sneeze or sneeze into your elbow because you don't want to meet the social disapproval of your peers for spreading germs during the flu season. Self-regulatory control, so keeping your behavior under normal control. Selecting relevant knowledge from irrelevant, that's really important in a clinical setting, right? We have to sift out what's important and what's not. Maintaining attention and stimulus response learning. And then the limbic loop links emotional, limbic, cognitive, motor systems. It identifies the value of stimuli. It's involved in reward-guided behaviors. So you might say, well, the limbic loop might be participating in that decision to stop and not run over the bicyclist, or make roads safe for bicyclists. Okay, so in the next section we are going to start to talk about basal ganglia disorders. Very interesting.